Buenas tardes, muy buenas tardes. Un saludo también a todas las personas que nos ven en directo a través de Canal Marc. Como saben, la sesión de hoy se desarrollará en inglés, pero para ayuda de las personas que no pueden seguir la sesión, tenemos a título orientativo unos subtítulos que verán aparecer en la parte de arriba de la pantalla y que esperemos que, gracias a la inteligencia artificial, nos permitan seguir a todos la conversación de hoy. Así que cambiamos a inglés y cruzamos los dedos. Good evening and welcome to the Palma branch of the Fundación Juan Marc. We are very pleased to present the third in our series of 4 lectures on the Grand Tour, the formative rite of passage that once brought young aristocrats from the north of Europe to the south. And today we're joined by a guest from the north, Dr. Adriano Aymonino. Good evening.
Good evening.
And thank you very much for kindly accepting our invitation. Adriano Aymonino is the Director of History and Art History at the University of Buckingham and leads the MA in Art Market, Provenance and Collecting. He studied History of Art at La Sapienza in Rome, earned an MA from the Warburg Institute in London and his PhD from IUAV and Università Ca' Foscari in Venice. He has held fellowships at the Paul Mellon Center in Yale, the Getty Research Institute, and the Huntington Library in New York. And Adriano is a specialist in Enlightenment era visual culture and classical tradition. His latest book is Enlightened Eclecticism, published by Yale University in 2021. He has co-edited the reissue of the new edition of Taste and the Antique, the classic book by Francis Haskell and Nicholas Penny, and has published widely on collecting, art theory and patronage. He's currently researching the relationship between materiality and the taste of the early 18th century, especially in connection to the Grand Tour, and his forthcoming book is titled Paper Marbles, Pierleone Ghessi's Studio di Molte Pietre, coming up next year. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Adriano Aymonino.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. Good evening, everybody, and I hope that the translation is accurate, because AI will not only translate from English, but also from someone who is Italian speaking in English. So let's see. So Italiano. So I know, but I need to speak in English, otherwise probably some of the guests will not understand anything. So let's see. Let's test AI first and foremost. Tonight I will basically guide you through the aesthetical principles behind the ritual of the Grand Tour. So I have structured my presentation showing you what are the cultural roots of the Grand Tour, and then why we associate the Grand Tour with the English and the British in general in the 18th century, and then I will show you more or less the vast range of objects that actually were produced for the Grand Tour markets and were brought back to Britain by most of the British travelers, or at least those who could afford this type of product. We all associate the Grand Tour with images like this. This is probably the most famous of all paintings related to the Grand Tour and to the Grand Tour ritual and the Grand Tour artistic industry. Many catalogs of exhibitions, many monographs on the Grand Tour have this painting on the cover. A wonderful painting by Giovanni Paolo Pannini, a sort of imaginary capriccio, an imaginary reconstruction of a gallery filled with all paintings about Roman architecture, Roman sculpture, Roman paintings. Is a sort of like canon in one room, which, as you can imagine, is completely imaginary, right? Is a reconstruction of what theoretically a gentleman would like to bring back to his or her home once the Grand Tour travel has finished. But objects like this, where you have, a young, well-dressed gentleman surrounded by the canonical pieces of sculpture and architecture of the Grand Tour, is just the tail end of a phenomenon that actually stretched over 400 years and involved most of the nationalities of Europe. So what I would like to stress today is that actually this is a pan-European phenomenon. It's not necessarily related only to Britain and the English in particular. It's something that actually stretches as far back as at least the 16th century. The ultimate origins of the Grand Tours are the medieval pilgrimage which united the north of Europe, so the British Islands, the Scandinavian peninsula, Germany, etc., to Italy and the Mediterranean. So these routes that were established at least since the 11th century and then progressed and grew exponentially in the 12th and 13th century, connecting the north of Europe with Italy and Italy with the Holy Land, because Italy was in a way the middle step where many people gathered and then traveled again towards Jerusalem, Antioch, Alessandretta, etc., etc. So these routes actually then became more and more established in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. But most of the routes that actually were used by the Grand Tourist in the golden age of the Grand Tour, the 18th century, were still the medieval routes opened by the pilgrim in the Middle Ages. So the ultimate origins of the Grand Tour are religious and they are located in the Middle Ages. This is a wonderful map at the beginning of early 18th century map produced in England. By the 16th century, religious motivations in a way were completely, not completely, because pilgrims, especially during the Jubilee years, still traveled to Rome, but were mainly replaced by cultural reasons. So the first, in a way, the first incarnation of the Grand Tour as a pan-European phenomenon is in the beginning of the 16th century. At the beginning of the 16th century, when Renaissance culture, in a way, started to spread all over Europe, especially through the printing press. This, as far as I'm aware, is the first testimony of a phenomenon that then will increase exponentially. And I need to turn for once, because I need to read it. It is in the Prosa della Volgar Lingua, a very famous book by Pietro Bembo, who was a very famous scholar, one of the greatest scholars of the High Renaissance in Rome, a friend of Raphael, a friend of Julius II and Leo X, one of the great cardinal scholars and humanists of the Roman Curia at the beginning of the 16th century. And in his Prosa della Volgar Lingua, he says, Roma, I will read it in Italian and then I will translate it into English. Roma vede tutto il giorno a sé venire molti artefici di vicine e di lontane parti, i quali le belle antiche figure di marmo e talor di rame, e gli archi e le terme e i teatri e gli altri diversi edifici che in alcuna loro parte sono in piedi, con in studio cercando nel piccolo spazio delle loro carte o cere la forma di quelli rapportano. Bembo is saying that every day Rome sees throughout all days and all the days of the week, coming from the north, many artists from close by or far away, which actually are there in Rome to copy the ancient sculptures in marble or in bronze, and the arches, the baths, the theaters, and many other buildings which are still standing in Rome. And with a lot of study and effort, they try actually to retain the memory of these sculptures and buildings in the small spaces of their papers, so sketchbooks, or waxes. So because the sculptures, of course, they modeled in wax at the beginning, then terracotta, and then marble. And they try to recreate, of course, the memory and the principles of ancient sculptures and ancient buildings in sketchbooks and in waxes. This is the first mention of a phenomenon that then was already established. We are in 1525, but this is, when Bembo writes this, is roughly 10 years earlier. Already by 1515, the Rome of Raphael, the Rome of Michelangelo, the Rome of the Sixtine Chapel, many artists came to Rome to copy classical architecture and classical sculpture. And this is ultimately the very reason of the phenomenon of the Grand Tour, as I will try to demonstrate throughout this lecture. By the end of the 16th century, this phenomenon had become established in a way, right? Following the different nationalities that came to Rome in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, is akin to follow the spread of the Renaissance and humanist ideals to different areas of Europe. In the 16th century, most travelers to Rome were the so-called fiamminghi, so Flemish and Dutch. The 17th century was mostly a French phenomenon, with Poussin, with Laurent, etc., etc. But the 18th century was certainly the golden age of the Grand Tour and is the century of the British, for reasons that I would like to postpone for a second. So by the end of the 16th century, this phenomenon had become already established. The infrastructure of the Grand Tour, so hotels, postal services, artist studios, academies in Rome, catering for an international number of artists and travelers, had been already established. So our conception that the Grand Tour is an 18th century phenomenon is somehow wrong. It's something that starts very, very, very much earlier in the 16th century. This is an extraordinary drawing, one of my favorite one, drawn by Federico Zucchero, who is one of these late Mannerist artists working in Rome, but he was from the Marche, so he's a foreigner who traveled to Rome with his brother Taddeo Zucchero in the middle of the 16th century, and Federico Zucchero is showing his elder brother learning how to represent the human figure, learning how to draw. So it's a drawing showing you how you learn how to draw. It's a sort of meta drawing, and there are many like this. And the young Taddeo is in the Belvedere courtyard in the Vatican, under the midday sun, without touching his water and his sandwich there. He spends hours and hours under the Roman sun copying the most famous of all classical sculptures that could be seen in Rome at that time, the Lacon. Maybe today, maybe it's the only statue that we still remember, because all this canon has completely collapsed in the 20th century. So he's there copying the Lacon, and also we see here the Apollo Belvedere, which we will see again in a minute, which of course by the late 16th century was so famous that you could just represent half of it, and people would immediately, mentally, complete the rest of the sculpture. So this wonderful drawing is framed by the very reason that young artists came to Rome. Copy classical sculpture in order to learn how to represent the human figure. Not only the human figure, but the idealized human figure, the classical human figure. And this could be the topic of a different lecture. But remember, this is the essence of why Rome became the very reason of the Grand Tour, and certainly the city that could not be missed in any Grand Tour. Not only classical sculpture, but these drawings actually sums up the different activities the young artists were supposed to do during their stay in Rome. Copying classical architecture as well, measuring, surveying, and understanding the principles of classical architecture. You have the Pantheon, you have the Trajan Column, you have the Pons Fabricium, so the Fabrician bridge there, etc., etc. And also, remember this element, I love this drawing because it's absolutely programmatic in a way. On the back you have Le Camere di Raffaello, so the famous stanze of Raphael, like the stanza della Segnatura, and you have artists copying Raphael there. So this holy trinity in a way, classical statues, classical architecture, and Raphael and his school became basically the canon that was supposed to be absorbed by artists throughout Europe. Challenged, criticized by many different schools throughout the centuries, but nonetheless this gave the norm that actually conditioned European aesthetics for 400 years. And of course you could see these things in Rome, and this is the very reason why Rome became the center of this phenomenon. As I said, it's a phenomenon that actually step by step grows throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and we will focus on the 18th century and the British because, of course, that's the golden age of this phenomenon. But just to show you that already by 1670, this guidebook by Richard Lassell, which was printed in Paris but for a British market, which already gives you the idea of this, cosmopolitan culture of the Grand Tour. This, you're looking on the screen at the very first mention of the word Grand Tour. So the first time that the word appears in any publication is Richard Lassell, 1670 edition of his Voyage to Italy. Very interesting, in this case, at the beginning, the Grand Tour of France and the Giro of Italy. At the beginning, the Grand Tour is associated with France in a British imagination, but as you will see, almost immediately, at the end of the 18th century, it will change. And it will change because something really and truly revolutionary happens in British culture and in British politics at the end of the 17th century, which in a way, conditions the relationship of the British with the classical past and with Italy. I first will show you this quotation, and this is the last quotation that I will read, in 1725 by Jonathan Richardson, who is the first art theoretician of Britain. Britain arrives quite late on the European scene in terms of art and in terms of production of a theory of art. And Jonathan Richardson, in his very famous essay on the theory of painting, which can be considered the first truly theoretical book on art ever produced in Britain, says, "No nation under heaven so nearly resembles the ancient Greeks and Romans than we. There is a haughty courage, an elevation of thought, a greatness of taste, a love of liberty, a simplicity and honesty among us, which we inherit from our ancestors and which belong to us as Englishmen." Of course, he's an Englishman, but the phenomenon could be basically is as Scottish and as Irish as English. And in this, and it is in this resemblance consists. This is a very clear statement of the analogy that by the beginning of the 18th century in most British culture was made between contemporary England and Britain and ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Why? And this is the very reason why this absorption of this analogy and identification with classical Greece and Rome from, the contemporary British is the reason why they became the dominant demographic group that actually started to travel to Italy in the 18th century. So we need to understand why this change of aesthetic and this change of culture in the 18th century. And there are many different reasons. But the most important one is that in 1688 and 1689 in Britain you have the so-called Glorious Revolution. James II, a king that was Catholic, not supposed to be Catholic, he was Catholic, was expelled by the vast Protestant majority, and instead William III of Orange and his wife Mary were brought in order to guarantee a Protestant succession to the British throne. He is expelled and he goes to Europe and then to Rome. He becomes basically the steward in exile. From 1688 and 1689, there are many different reasons, but remember one. For the first time, with the arrival of William III and Mary, you have the foundation of the first constitutional monarchy of modern Europe. A constitutional monarchy where you have a balance between the king, between the upper house, which is the House of Lords, and between the lower house, which is the House of Commons. It's the first monarchy in Europe where the king doesn't rule by decree, but needs to consult Parliament and especially Senate in order to approve especially things in terms of finance and war. So it's the first balanced and mixed constitution of modern Europe, a principle that then will spread all over at least the countries that are governed by monarchy in the 18th and 19th century. Why this establishment of a constitutional monarchy is so important? Because this balance between the king, the Senate, and the House of Commons, actually, in the mind of many members of the elite in Britain, which were educated on the classics, they grew up reading, Cicero, Tacitus, Virgil, etc., in their mind, this, in a way, was a modern incarnation of the constitution of ancient Republican Rome, where you had a consul, a senate, and then the tribunes of the plebs. So a balance between monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. And of course, in this analogy, they saw themselves as the rightful inheritors of ancient Republican Rome, and the only country where actually this balance was achieved. And hence, they consider themselves the new Romans, as simple as that. In an age where, of course, you have an expanding empire. By the early 18th century, Britain and France starts, of course, to take over Holland and the Netherlands in general. Just to give you a visual example, which is absolutely revelatory in a way, in 1689, and I would say up until 1705, this is the traditional fashion, right? Long wigs, a lot of frolic, typical Baroque presentation. Look at this type of busts, which actually started to spread in Britain from 1715 onwards, when the Hanoverian monarchy and the end of the War of Austrian Succession, in a way, truly kick-started the age of classicism and the age of the Grand Tour in England, especially supported by a party which was called the Whig Party, but also which was, let's say, the Liberal Party. But also the Tories, in a way, embraced, so the more conservative party embraced this type of iconography. You see, these are all senators, both Whig and Tories, all of them representing themselves as ancient Roman senators, no? With no wigs, with the toga, and with this is called the paludamentum, which is the way ancient senators and ancient generals represented themselves. So this analogy between modern Britain, with its mixed constitution, and ancient Rome is made visible in stone in the way the elite represented themselves from 1715 onwards. And I think exactly this juxtaposition is absolutely revelatory of what happened in Britain. There's one place where this analogy, this metaphor is made visible. There are many places in Britain, but if you travel to Britain, go and visit probably the most beautiful English garden of the 18th century, which is Stowe. It's very close to the university where I teach in Buckingham. And at the center of Stowe, you have, in this so-called Elysian fields, where the river Styx runs in the middle. Everything is artificial, although it looks natural. You have on one side the temple of British worthies, so the temple of modern British heroes. You have Elizabeth I, you have Newton, you have Locke, you have, you have many other representative of modern British culture, and facing the temple of British worthies, on the other side of the river, you have the temple of ancient virtue, where instead you have bust of Homer, you have bust of Socrates, etc., etc. So this analogy again is made evident in stone again. It's quite, for a scholar, it's quite amazing to see how literal is this analogy in the 18th century, and it's quite rewarding if one wants to unpick this phenomenon. So I would say from 1715 onwards, by far the dominant population, the dominant nation that started to actually arrive in Venice, Florence. They start, of course, with Paris, Lyon, Turin, etc., etc. But remember, the ultimate destination was Rome, for obvious reasons, for all the reasons that I mentioned. A very complex trip, because remember, the map of Europe of the 18th century is much more fragmented than Europe today. And so you had to have with you a lot of, of documents that actually allow you to cross boundaries and borders, letters of introductions, different currencies, etc., etc. Was a trip that actually had to be prepared very carefully, at least 2 days in advance, 2 years in advance. So a very complex phenomenon, but most of the British elite was supposed, between the age of 16 and the age of 21, to go through this rite of passage. So they started from London, they went to Paris. Usually there are many, many different routes, but I'm showing you the traditional one. From Paris to Lyon, crossing the Alps, Turin, Venice, Florence, Rome. And in the second half of the 18th century, after the discovery of Pompeii in 1738, of Herculaneum in 1738 and Pompeii in 1748, also Naples became one of the great destinations of the Grand Tour. But at the center of everything, remember, is Rome. So there are many articles, essays, and books published recently that try, in a way, to rewrite the canonical narrative of the Grand Tour, quite rightly, because the Grand Tour needs new ideas in many ways, and they stress the pan-European character of the Grand Tour. Many people went to Germany, for instance. Many people went to the Netherlands to study politics there, or to study classics in the great University of Utrecht, of Leiden. But remember that Rome, of course, was the ultimate destination. Just to give an example, this book, an account of some of the statues, bas-relief and drawings and pictures in Italy, by Jonathan Richardson, the same Richardson that wrote the treatise on the theory of painting that we saw before. This is the ultimate guidebook of the 18th century. It's the Lonely Planet of the 18th century. Reprinted many different times. Everybody who went to Italy had, at least if they were British, had a copy of Richardson in their pocket. It's an octavo, so it's a little book that could easily fit in your pocket. Half of the book is devoted to Rome, and that, of course, is indicative of the importance of the capital of classical culture there. When they arrived in Rome, and you're looking at probably the greatest map ever produced in the 18th century, the famous Nolli map of 1748, which is contemporary to John Rock map of London and the Turgot map of Paris. The 1740s and 50s are one of the great ages of map making in early modern Europe. The Nolli map of Rome is enormous, it's gigantic. You're seeing it's much larger than what you see on the screen actually. And it's a, it's a topographic view of Rome in 1748. Most travelers entered from the north, from the Via Flaminia, Porta del Popolo, and then the Trident would have led them to the monumental center of Rome, the ancient Forum, or to the Spanish Steps, which was the British Quarter. All the British were actually distributed around the Spanish Steps and Via del Babuino. That is called, in 18th century sources, the British Quarter. Rome, in the middle of the 18th century, is the Academy of Europe. There's a whole network and infrastructures of bankers, dealers, restorers, artist studios, academies, prices for young artists. So a whole infrastructure had been created in order to train young artists who came from Scotland, Britain, Copenhagen, etc., etc. Think, for instance, that half of British artists between 1750 and 1768, the year of the foundation of the Royal Academy of Art, half of them traveled to Rome to round off their education in the living presence of the antique and of Renaissance painting and Baroque painting. So it's a city that actually still, if Paris is the capital of modern Europe in terms of art, Rome still is the Academy of Europe in terms of artistic training, with a very sophisticated and complex infrastructural system that was crucial. To go back to the reasons why you came to Rome to study, I will show you two. But remember, because I've already showed you several, before I showed you the Lacon and the Apollo at Belvedere, Raphael's rooms, Raphael's stanze, the Trajan column. In the background of Zucchero drawing, you see the Pantheon. So now let's focus on this building here, which is the Pantheon, and one statue that was kept here in the Belvedere courtyard in the Vatican. But the same exercise could be done on many different buildings and many different classical statues. Just to give you an idea, many people came to Rome, especially if they were architects, to survey and understand the compositional logic and the proportions of ancient temples. So they could actually not only understand it through the medium of drawing, which is of course is a critical intellectual act, but also publish publications with the exact proportions of capitals, columns, entablatures, pediments that then could be replicated in buildings in London, in Manchester, or even in the United States of America. Look at the Pantheon, which of course is one of the few ancient temples that survives almost intact, with a lot of restoration in the 17th and 18th century, but it's almost intact. Palladio, the great, and remember this name, the great architect of Venice and the Venetian hinterland of the late 16th century, who became the hero of the British in the 18th century. Palladio had already published, among many others, elevations, sections, and proportional drawings of the Pantheon and many other buildings in Rome in 1570 in his famous 4 books of architecture. Through Palladio and through the many, many drawings and later subsequent publications on the ancient buildings of Rome, these typologies spread all over Europe and all over the Western world, even to India and the territories of the expanding Commonwealth. Just to give you an idea, this is the plate, the half elevation of the facade of the Pantheon in Palladio, and then you have Villa La Rotonda by Palladio, Chiswick House by the Earl of Burlington in London. Also, this is a pavilion in Chiswick Garden. Stowhead, a great park in England. Le Panthéon in Paris. The Library of the University of Virginia in the United States of America, Charlottesville, built by Thomas Jefferson, and the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. But citations from the Pantheon, every time you see a portico with a pediment attached to a building, that comes from the Pantheon in a way. It's a wrong interpretation that Palladio made of the Pantheon, thinking that actually any ancient great palaces of the Roman patricians in ancient times had a pedimented portico attached to a house, which is wrong, but his interpretation actually had an immense impact on Western architecture. I'm focusing on the Pantheon, but remember that exactly the same exercise could be done on the Colosseum, on the Arch of Constantine, on the Trajan Column, etc., etc., etc. So ancient architecture. So the first reason why they came to Rome, especially architects. Ancient sculpture. This is probably the core of the canonical taste that spread all over Europe. This taste for the antique, and especially taste for a limited number of ancient sculptures, many of which were Roman copies or Roman re-elaborations of lost great Greek sculptures, is really the phenomenon at the center of the Grand Tour. So, in many ways, what you're looking on the screen is just a small selection of roughly 100 classical statues that you could see in Rome, some in Florence, a few in Venice, but mostly in Rome, 90% of them, that actually constituted the canon for almost 500 years. Forget about the Mona Lisa, Van Gogh, Vermeer, Monet, Picasso. These were the works of art that actually everybody with a minimum of education would have known throughout Europe for 500 years. This canon throughout the 19th century and especially in the 20th century has collapsed drastically, and is probably the starkest reminder that taste is a relative construct, is not absolute, and can fall very quickly if different aesthetic criteria are established within a culture. But this great population of statues that started to emerge from the soil of Rome from the 16th century onwards really actually were the works of art that everybody came to Rome to see, and works of art that actually were replicated throughout Europe in millions of copies, in print, in drawing, in plaster cast, in bronzes, etc., etc. I will focus on one, which probably we still know what it is today, at least judging by people in the Vatican that stops for a few seconds in front of it, rushing towards the Sixtine Chapel, but still maybe someone, they completely ignore the Apollo Belvedere, the Antinous Belvedere, etc., etc., but they still stop in front of the Laocoon, which is probably the only classical sculpture, together with the Venus de Milo at the Louvre, which is still part of a shared, in a way, visual culture, global visual culture. I'm not here to defend the canon, mind you. I'm here to try to dissect why this canon was so important in European culture and visual imagery for a period of roughly 500 years. Just to give you an idea, when the Laocoon was discovered in 1506, in February 1506, Michelangelo was sent by Julius II on the excavation site on the Esquiline. Michelangelo arrives, this is of course is reported by Vasari, so we need to trust Vasari, but probably it's true. Arrived with Giuliano da San Gallo and said, this is the famous Laocoon that was mentioned by Pliny in the house of Tiberius. And they, of course, they took it above ground, and the Pope immediately bought it and placed it in the Belvedere courtyard, so the great collection of the Pope in the Vatican. And mind you that, not surprisingly, the Pope had the right of first pick when it came to classical statues. The impact that the Laocoon and this very muscular idealized anatomy, this twisted anatomy, this complex compositional logic of the three interlocked figures together had an immense impact on the visual arts of Europe from 1506 onwards. Without this quite restricted number of sculptures, without the discovery of many of the sculptures between the end of the 15th century and the middle of the 16th century from the soil of Rome, when Rome was expanding as a city, and so many foundations had to be dug up, and so many of the statues actually were discovered in the first 50 years of the 16th century, the history of Western art would have been probably completely different. Not better, not worse, but certainly completely different. Michelangelo studies the Laocoon carefully, very, very carefully, and the 16th Chapel, these muscular bodies, these twisted bodies, the predominance of these very muscular nudes in the 16th Chapel would have been absolutely inconceivable without Michelangelo's study of the Laocoon. And this is what happens then, right? Exactly because it was placed in the Belvedere courtyard, exactly because it had the blessing of Michelangelo, it became the most famous works of art in the Western world. From the earliest drawings, prints, this is Rubens, you see already the Baroque point of view on diagonal, dynamic, on the Laocoon, full-size copies in marble, full-size copies in bronze, little waxes, anatomical studies, faience dishes, El Greco taking inspiration from the Laocoon, small gems, cameos, Daumier satirizing the Laocoon in the 19th century. Between this drawing and this satirical print, there are 350 years, and you see that we've been around Europe, no? From Italy to the Flanders, and then to Spain, and then to France. So it's a pan-European phenomenon. The diffusion of this canonical taste from Rome to the rest of Europe is really at the center of this Grand Tour phenomenon. And as I say, this could be done for roughly 100 sculptures. The Laocoon is the works of art in the history of humankind, and this is evident for anyone like me who actually spent too many years studying the reception of this type of classical statuary. The Laocoon is the works of art in the history of humankind, not only the Western world, on which most has been written, for sure. Now probably matched by the Mona Lisa or by Picasso Guernica step by step, but it's the work of art on which for centuries most was written in terms of, publications, diaries, etc., etc. And this is interesting in itself from, let's say, an anthropological point of view. But this is the phenomenon. So, exactly, you go to Rome to copy classical architecture and to understand the principles of classical architecture and to bring back the proportions and the compositional logic of classical architecture to Britain, to France, to Germany. You study classical sculpture in order to understand the principles of the idealized human figure, the proportions of the idealized human figure, and bring back that knowledge to Utrecht, to London, or to Madrid. But also, they, especially from the 17th century onwards, especially the wealthy travelers, started to bring back an army of copies. Because this taste is so normative, is so canonical, that of course, you cannot bring back the Laocoon or the Medici Venus to, let's say, Stourhead or to Sion House, Oldham Hall, or to Fontainebleau. You bring back copies in order to show the fact that you are part of a shared pan-European taste and that you are, in a way, a connoisseur, someone who actually can understand and abides to that shared taste that it's typical of the European Republic of Letters. So let's start now the second part of the lectures. What did they commission, all these travelers? What did they bring back to the northern shores of Europe? I will show you mostly the British because, as I say, in the 18th century, the dominant nation the dominant travelers who traveled to Rome were British. In the second half of the century, many Germans, Russians, Scandinavians, Spanish joined the trend, but certainly, in a way, the dynamics of the 18th century Grand Tour and the taste of the 18th century Grand Tour was mostly shaped by the British. English, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh, who of course hated each other. And all of them had completely different communities in Rome, tried to compete with one another in order to bring back as many copies or commissions of paintings, especially. Just to show you an example, the Venus de' Medici, which was in the 18th century in Florence, but it had been discovered in Rome and was in Villa Medici for most of the 16th and 17th century, the most famous female classical statue. You could not bring back this famous classical statue to Britain, first and foremost because most of them had been acquired by the Pope. Second right of choice was the cardinals, the great cardinals of Rome, the Farnese, the Borghese, the Giustiniani, the Ludovisi, the Medici, whoever actually had villas and collections in Rome. Third, because from the late 17th century there's a series of edicts, papal edicts, very avant-garde, against the exportation of classical statues and of paintings outside Rome and outside Italy. So it was very difficult to export famous sculptures like this to Britain. And so an army of copies started to be produced. These are some of the most beautiful copies ever produced in the first half of the 18th century by Massimiliano Soldani Benzi, full-size bronze copies of the Medici Venus. Not surprisingly, you see that actually two of them are, one is in the Liechtenstein collection in Vienna now, but two of them are in Blenheim, and the third one today at the Getty came from Wentworth Woodhouse, another British country house. So the Brits are the main patrons and those who really commissioned this army of statues. By placing a full-size bronze copy of the Venus de' Medici inside Blenheim, you see that you show that you have been on a grand tour, that you have the financial capacity and the financial possibility of commissioning something that was excruciatingly expensive to produce in the 18th century. A full-size bronze was incredibly expensive. Then you had to crate it, pay the transport custom duties from Livorno to Gibraltar and then to London, and then shipping, so incredibly expensive. The crating, shipping, and custom duty very often were more expensive than the commission itself in the 18th century, as you can imagine. Very often disrupted by war, so incredibly complex. So showing a full-size bronze copy of the Venus de' Medici, of course, was not just a cultural signal, but a clear economic statement of power in many ways. So copies of canonical sculptures. Second, copies, an army of copies of old masters. So the famous stanze di Raffaello, which we saw in that inscription in Taddeo Zucchero drawing, copies of Raphael and his school, or copies of the followers of who was perceived as the followers of Raphael, Annibale Carracci, Guido Reni, Domenichino, Marat, etc., really actually dominate the market of copies throughout Northern Europe. You're seeing here the original one in the Vatican and the most famous life-size copy of the School of Athens by Anton Raphael Mengs, which was commissioned by probably the richest man in England in the 18th century, the first Duke of Northumberland, for Northumberland House. A whole cycle that included also the Aurora by Guido Reni, the Triumph of Bacchus by Annibale Carracci in Palazzo Farnese. So a whole room in the center of London which celebrated Raphael and his school and was open to artists in London to copy. If you could not afford to go to Rome, the Duke of Northumberland brings Raphael and Rome to London for pedagogical purposes. So copies of classical statues, copies of Raphael, and whenever they could, real old masters. They started to collect an enormous amount of paintings which were brought back to England and to Britain in general. Very often paintings by Raphael and truly important old masters were in Italian collections and could not be alienated from Italian collections. But Guido Reni, the Italian Baroque of the 17th century, the Flemish masters, Van Dyck, Rubens, and especially you're looking at a painting by Guido Reni, who was supposed to be one of the great followers of Raphael a century later. The Bolognese school is altogether, in a way, considered by 18th century art theory as, the followers of Raphael. So Guido Reni and the Italian classical Baroque was collected, but paintings by Raphael, very few reached England in the 18th century too, actually. It's only in the 19th century, after the Orleans sale at the end of the 18th century, that great old masters started to come to Britain. So Guido Reni and his school, but a huge amount of classical landscapes produced especially by the French in the 17th century, by Claude Lorrain, by Caspar Daguet, etc. The wonderful, picturesque, idyllic landscape produced by the French in Italy in the 17th century became one of the favorite items to be brought back to England. In this case is a typical Claude Lorrain at Holkham Hall, and we will finish with Holkham Hall in a few minutes. You see here you have Argo and Io, so a classical theme. But the landscape is the landscape of the Roman countryside, of the contemporary Roman countryside, completely invented. Here you have the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli. There is this picturesque nature of the classical landscape that was invented in a way by Poussin, by Lorrain, by Daguet in the 1630s, 40s, and 50s, and then collected by the British in the 18th century, which will have an immense impact on, for instance, the British landscape garden, the picturesque garden of the 18th century. That's why it's called picturesque, for many different reasons, but also because it reminds the pictures, the paintings by Lorrain, Daguet, or Daguet, depending on how you pronounce it, etc. Remember the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, because we will see it again and again, was one of these canonical architectures like the Pantheon or the Arch of Constantine, and you will see that actually they recur in many of the artworks that I will show you today. So, copies of classical sculpture, copies of Raphael and his schools, real old masters, and landscapes of the 17th and 18th centuries. the crucial thing that we must remember always is that this culture spread all over Europe thanks to print, thanks to antiquarian publication, thanks to art treatises which had illustrations, especially etchings and engravings, thanks to an army of loose prints like Piranesi, probably the greatest engraver, etcher, actually, of the 18th century, a failed architect who actually became the greatest engraver of the 18th century, and he really contributed to shaping the image of Rome even before you travel to Rome. The famous quote by Goethe when he enters Rome from the Porta del Popolo, and he says, "Finally I enter the great capital of the world. Since my childhood I used to remember prints of Rome hanging in the room of my father," and he's talking about prints by Piranesi. So, and he enters, of course, the great capital of the world. If you read, all the Romans and all the Italians like to quote the first day of Goethe in Rome. If you start reading the second day, he says, "For us Northerner, it's very difficult to deal with the local population because they are completely different from us, etc., etc." Goethe trip to Italy is probably the greatest read on the Grand Tour phenomenon by the greatest writer and the greatest intellectual of the German-speaking world of ever, probably, but certainly of the 18th and 19th century. This army, this galaxy of antiquarian publication is really actually what shaped this taste all over Europe, because they're relatively cheap, they're printed in multiple copies, they're easy to transport, you pay relatively few custom duties on this publication, and they fill the libraries of country houses and townhouses and royal libraries and academic libraries all over Europe, from St. Petersburg to Lisbon, from Edinburgh to Palermo. So it's a shared culture that is really at the center of this phenomenon. I'm showing you just two publications. The Antiquité expliquée by Montfaucon, published in 1719, is the encyclopedia of the classical world of the 18th century. And of course, at the center you have the etchings of classical statues in the round that we have already seen. Piranesi's loose prints are sold all over Europe, but also drawings, a lot of drawings. I'm just going through the most important categories of items that were actually produced for the Grand Tour industry and brought back to Britain and to Germany and other countries. Mind you that this is the first time in early European art where art market demands, so the demands of the Grand Tour patron and collector, are so important that they have such a defining impact on the production of art itself, in a way. So there's a real Grand Tour industry that goes from, copies to engravings to drawings. There's a circle of great collectors, Richard Topham, the Earl of Leicester, the Earl of Burlington, between the 1710 and the 1720s, who actually start to commission to draftsmen in Rome an enormous amount of beautiful, look at the beauty of these drawings, this is really what I'm working on at the moment, these beautiful drawings on ancient ceilings, ancient wall paintings, ancient reliefs, etc., etc., mostly focusing on anything that had not been published in print, and especially in color, right? So that they could really bring back Rome in paper. These were real paper museums that were brought back to their townhouses and country houses and arranged topographically. So they create real atlases of ancient and modern Rome, arranged by area in Rome, i quartieri of Rome, either ancient or modern Rome. The real atlases that actually were open to members of the Royal Society, of the Society of Antiquaries, so the members of the Republic of Letters, to study Rome in Britain, paper museums. And of course, we reach now what everybody knows. I wanted to focus on categories of souvenirs that actually are not so well known, because they are probably the most important ones, but equally important, of course. You have vedute, landscapes of the places you had visited in Italy. I forgot a very important detail. Remember this is a beautiful drawing by Battoni in red chalk, by Pompeo Battoni, probably the greatest draftsman of classical antiquity in the 18th century, of a very famous relief that was then in the collection of the great Cardinal Albani and today in the Capitoline Museum. It's a relief of Endymion on Mount Latmos, and you will see that we will see it again pretty soon. Views of Venice, views of Florence, views of Rome, the most famous of all Venetian vedute painter, and an artist who actually produced most of his artistic output for international travelers is Canaletto, Antonio Canal, called Canaletto. What is the meaning of this type of vedute? The vedute, of course, are souvenirs. You bring them back to England, to Scotland, and what they used to do is to have rooms, very often dining rooms, covered with views of Venice and Rome, for instance, very often facing each other. So that, of course, when you invite guests, not only you are showing that you've been on a grand tour, but you can also, of course, souvenir, remember your experience in Venice, and very often your guests were equally members of the British elite, and they had been on a grand tour, which was an absolute obligatory rite of passage at this moment. So Canaletto in Venice, but also less famous, but equally important, Giovanni Paolo Pannini in Rome, the great vedute painter of Rome who catered for the English. Mind you that Pannini, unlike Canaletto, who actually very often shows you a real view of, in this case, Piazza San Marco with the Palazzo Ducale, the Libreria of Sansovino, etc., etc., Pannini does something even cleverer in a way. He brings together canonical buildings and statues that, of course, in Rome are scattered all over, so that in one painting you concentrate as much information as possible, and then when you come back home, you can, in a way, somehow interrogate your guest and say, so what is here? And you have the Colosseum, the Arch of Constantine, but also the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, which is in a completely different part of the Forum. You have the Dioscuri of the Quirinal, which the name, as the name suggests, are on the Quirinal, they're not on the Forum. You have the Borghese Gladiator, the Capitoline Gladiator. Look at this. This is the Endymion at Mount Latmos, drawn in red chalk by Pompeo Batoni. You find it here again, probably one of the most famous reliefs. The Medici vase, the Apollo Belvedere, which was in the Belvedere courtyard. So Pannini can bring together, everything for you, so that when you come back to England in your dining room, you can, point at the different sculptures and buildings and interrogate your educated guest. And we go back to where we started from. So this is the ultimate creation of the Grand Tour, where you have commissioned by the French ambassador in Rome, the Duc de Choiseul here. This is Pannini, and I will show you a detail in a second. And of course, you have an imaginary view of ancient Rome, where you have the Pantheon, you have the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina, you have the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, which we saw in that beautiful landscape painting by Lorraine. You have the Lacon, you have the Borghese Gladiator, you have the Apollo Belvedere, the Dying Gladiator, etc., etc. In one space, you're surrounded by ancient Rome. And painting, architecture, and sculpture are all brought together in dialogue. So this is a painting that simulates paintings of architecture. You understand the complexity of this layering? It's still, in a way, a Baroque imagery in a gigantic hall. And Pannini uses a typical theatrical framing, this drape that has been revealed in order to show you the ancient Rome. And if you look at the detail, you have the Duc de Choiseul here, Pannini there, but of course they are surrounded by young artists who, in the little space of their papers, like Pietro Bembo mentioned 250 years earlier, they are still there trying to understand the compositional logic of the human figures of ancient paintings or ancient architecture on their papers, etc., etc. So the Grand Tour, which, again, I want to stress this, today we associate with British aristocrat, is a much, much broader phenomenon. That involves artists, involves people called ciceroni, so tour guides who actually went on the Grand Tour sponsored by aristocrat. Is a pan-European phenomenon, and somehow today we consider it as very elitist phenomenon. But if we actually put ourselves in the shoes of the 18th century, for 18th century standard, is a very democratic phenomenon, especially compared to the 16th and 17th century, where very few people could travel, especially in the 17th century, which is a century ridden by war and plague. The 18th century is a century of travel, circulation of bodies and ideas, in a way. For contemporary standards, is elitist because, of course, 80% were young aristocrats, but for early modern standards, is a great century of expansion of this phenomenon. And, of course, another object that everybody brought back was paintings and portraits of themselves, especially by Pompeo Batoni, the great portrait painter of Rome, of young milordi dressed in the latest fashion and pointing, look again, the Temple of Vesta at Tivoli, which we saw already twice in Lorraine and Pannini, or here he's pointing at the so-called Cleopatra of the Vatican, and in the background you have the Apollo Belvedere and the Laocoon. You see how normative is this taste. The references are always the same. And not surprisingly, with the arrival of Romanticism, this normative taste, which by the end of the 18th century had become in a way constraining, especially in art academies, started to collapse and substituted by an aesthetic that privileged instead individual inspiration and the inspiration of nature rather than a shared universal code of conduct. I will finish, I still have 10 minutes, I will finish very quickly, but just to remind you that the Grand Tour is, we are discussing here lofty ideals and a rite of passage that involves culture and education, but most of these travelers were 16, 17, 18, they came to Italy to get drunk and have the first life experience, let's put it that way for want of a better term. This is a wonderful image by Pier Leone Ghezzi, the greatest caricaturist of the 18th century, showing Dr. James Hay, who was one of these ciceroni, this tutor, with his young protege. These ciceroni were called in Italy bear leaders because they were just, like those who actually trained young bears to entertain the public on roadsides throughout Europe, just to give you an idea that most of these young, poor travelers couldn't care less about antiquity, or at least they pretended to. But of course, for the first time, they could experience the world abroad without their parents. Another image that I love absolutely, this image by David Allen, and it's the arrival of a young traveler and his suite during the carnival in Piazza di Spagna in Rome. You see here you have Il Café degli Inglesi, and here you have the Ville de Londres, just to remind you that the Spanish Steps is the British Quarter. And the poor young milord is surrounded by all sort of, forgerers selling fake Madonnas by Raphael, pornographic images, and his retinue has been kidnapped by dancers, music makers, while a couple of British aristocrats is throwing coins to the population of Rome. This gives you an idea of how, in a way, complex and messy was the experience in itself. But tonight we are here to discuss art. But the logistics and the experience of the Grand Tour is a fascinating chapter in itself, in a way, at least as a rite of passage. So to conclude in 10 minutes, what did they do when they, especially those who actually were real connoisseurs and real collector and patrons, went back home to Britain? What did they do with everything they had learned? The books they had collected, the copies they had commissioned, the paintings that they had managed to buy. I will show you what they did in two places. One is Chiswick House, which is a suburban villa outside London, and the final one, and I will conclude with that, is Holkham Hall, probably the greatest country house, the greatest palace of art, which was established by the Earl of Leicester, one of the great connoisseurs, as a temple of the arts after his Grand Tour in the 1710. Chiswick House was built by the Earl of Burlington and his protege, William Kent. These two, together with a third one, which is Colin Campbell, are the tastemakers of the 1710, 20s, 30s, and 40s. The Earl of Burlington is, through his writings, through his commission, etc., he went to Italy several times. He's a great connoisseur. He's an architect. He's a trained architect. And William Kent was originally a painter, but then an architect. They shaped the so-called Neo-Palladian phase of British neoclassicism of the 18th century. and is the great classical phase of Grand Tour aesthetic in Britain. So remember, the Earl of Burlington and William Kent. And together they built Chiswick House, which is a sort of dual miniature building outside London, used as a sort of pavilion for the discussion of art, politics, and culture. It's not a place where you live. There was a huge house attached, which was demolished later on. But you see, Chiswick House is a clear homage to Palladio and Villa Rotonda. So they're already citing Palladio in the exterior with this replication of the pedimented portico. In the centrality of the building, because it's a central plan symmetrically arranged along a central axis, which is exactly what happened in the Rotonda of Palladio. But you will see this principle of citation of canonical models is incarnated perfectly at Chiswick House. So pretend now we are entering Chiswick House, and pretend that you are there in the so-called sculpture gallery, and you're looking at these apses. And I'll show you how they mixed antiquity, Renaissance, and British precedents, right? So the holy trinity of classical architecture and Vitruvius, Renaissance architecture and Palladio, and early classical architecture made by a great architect called Inigo Jones. Look at the structure of this room, which is absolutely programmatic in its citation of classical and Renaissance sources. If you focus on these apse, this is called an apsidal conch, and you focus on the pattern of the coffering, this lozenge pattern, is a literal citation of the Temple of Venus in Rome. Sorry, I left the Italian caption, but this is the Temple of Venus in Rome, which had been already engraved by Palladio and by many other architects from the 16th century onwards. So anyone who had been on a grand tour and had received even a superficial training in architecture, and mind you that most male, even some female aristocrat and members of the elite in Europe in the 18th century were trained in architecture. It's the great age of the amateur architect. Everybody would have recognized a citation to classical Rome and the Temple of Venus in Rome. If you focus on this window here, this is not classical. It was invented in the 16th century by a guy, it was already used by Bramante, but then popularized by a guy called Sebastiano Serlio, who is one of the greatest architects of the last part of the 16th century, and then popularized through his publication throughout Europe. The Serliana, which of course imitates a triumphal arch, you're looking at this window here, comes from a Renaissance prototype. So here Lord Burlington and William Kent are instead citing Serlio, Palladio, and the Italian Renaissance. Before they were citing ancient Rome, now the Italian Renaissance. If you look at the paneling and the coffering of the ceiling, is instead a clear reference to the only architect that before the Earl of Burlington and William Kent had already tried to import the classical principle of architecture 100 years before, in the great age of Charles I, of Van Dyck, of Rubens, the great court of Charles I in London, and is Inigo Jones. This is the ceiling of the banqueting house, published by William Kent in the same years when he was building Chiswick House, and you see that the coffering is absolutely derived from. In the same room, you have ancient Rome, you have Renaissance Italy, and you have the previous attempt at bringing the classical principles in Italy, in England. So the holy trinity of this normative taste, of this rule of taste. Look at the sculptures. Who are we? Here we are the Venus de' Medici and the Medici Mercury. Copies, of course. These are plaster casts, these are copies, 20th century copies now, but they were actually placed there by William Kent. Copies of the Mercury, of the Medici Mercury and the Venus de' Medici, which of course were in Florence, but by quoting them, you also refer to, of course, the most famous works of art in the Western world. So in one room you have everything. And of course, the medium through which they picked which sculptures could fit the niche in the sculpture gallery at Chiswick is again a great antiquarian publication, the Raccolta di Statue Antiche e Moderne, so the collection of ancient and modern statues, which is a book that is in any library of Europe of the 18th century, is the standard book published in 1704 on classical statues that everybody would have literally flicked through the pages to select which one they wanted to be copied in their houses. I have 2 slides and I finish. let's look at what happens in a much bigger country house, right? We were looking at a small pavilion outside London, something that can be considered as a suburban villa. What you're looking at is the typical Grand Tour country house, probably the most famous of them all, together with Siam, maybe, together with Houghton. But Holkham is the incarnation of probably the greatest connoisseur of the 18th century, the first Earl of Leicester, who was a great patron, traveled to Italy many, many times, brought back with him a lot of those antiquarian drawings that I showed you before, many old masters, etc., etc. Again, by William Kent. You see, it's an attempt at recreating an ancient imperial palace, for instance, the villa of Pliny or the villa of Cicero in the English countryside in Norfolk. If we go inside, you have here, I think is this one, if memory serves me right, there is another famous sculpture gallery with real sculptures. He's one of the few who manages to actually to bring back, because of his financial power, and also because he's one of the few British milordi who are respected by the Italian antiquarians, who are notoriously crooks and used to take advantage of the Brits in the 18th century. But the Earl of Leicester is one who is respected even in Italy, and he manages actually to export. These are real ancient sculptures. But if you look, of course, at the sculpture gallery of Holkham Hall, is an absolute citation of Chiswick. So you see, once you have the reassemblage of these models in Britain, then even the modus operandi of this new British compositional logic, architectural compositional logic, is repeated throughout the 18th century. If we look at the other rooms, we have, of course, rooms where he assembled all the great old masters. We have already seen Joseph and the Wife of Putifare by Guido Reni. We have a copy of a painting by Raphael showing Julius II. You have a painting by Sir Peter Lely, a Lorraine, etc., etc. So a south dining room which is completely covered with old masters, a bust of Homer, a bust of Aristotle, damask from Genoa, and in the frieze you have the frieze of the Temple of Antoninus and Faustina. You see, everything is consistent here in a way. The old masters, the school of Raphael, the bust of ancient poets and ancient philosophers, the frieze of one of the most famous temples in Rome, damask from Genoa, etc. Is a clear, so the taste, this taste of the British in the 18th century, which is a direct result of the Grand Tour, is very normative, is very codified. Either you stuck to it or you were an outsider. And there are many outsiders. Hogarth is a typical outsider because, of course, the most inventive and rebellious artist couldn't care less about this normative taste, which actually was taking away commissions in London from their own art in a way. Gosh, what have I done? Are we fine?
Yep.
Yes. Can I carry on? So another room is completely devoted to landscape by Duguay, by Lorraine, etc., etc. You see, he brings back everything that he collected in Rome. Not only the classical statues, sorry about this, but I have few slides, so we can. Not only the classical statues, the principles of classical architecture, the old masters, the landscape room, etc., etc. You see how, in a way, consistent is the Earl of Leicester in his display. But also a great library, right, where you have Palladio's works, Inigo Jones' works, you have Alberti's architecture, etc., etc. The library is, in a way, the beating heart of all these collections, because in the library you have all these antiquarian publications on classical architecture, on classical sculpture, etc., etc. I want to finish with this citation, which is one of the most famous. Thank you. Which is one of the most famous. Is this working? Maybe. Is one of the most famous ever quoted, but there's a twist. There's a certain irony in this. This is in James Boswell, who is one of the great biographers of the 18th century, a great, in a way, journalist, let's put it that way. It's an anachronist definition of the 18th century. In his famous Life of Samuel Johnson. Johnson is one of the most famous intellectuals of the 18th century, the compiler of the first British dictionary. And famously, Johnson says in this citation, a man, and he never went to Italy. Johnson never went to Italy. Says, a man who has not been in Italy is always conscious of an inferiority, from his not having seen what is expected a man should see, The grand object of traveling is to see the shores of the Mediterranean, On those shores were the four great empires of the world, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Grecians, and the Romans. All our religion, and he's talking about contemporary Britain, all our religion, almost all our law, almost all our art, almost all that sets us above the savages has come to us from the shores of the Mediterranean. This is a citation that, of course, gives you an idea of the dominant role of the Grand Tour as a social and cultural ritual in the culture of Britain and Europe in the 18th century. But mind you, there's also an element of irony. He never went to Italy, and somehow we are in 1776, he's criticizing this normative and constraining role that the Grand Tour had in British culture. But he never went, actually. So you always have to, in a way, approach these primary sources with a critical point of view. So just to conclude, remember that actually, yes, the golden age of the Grand Tour is the 18th century. Yes, most of the Grand Tour art was produced in the 18th century, especially for a British public, for all the reasons, political and cultural, that we outlined before. But the roots of the Grand Tours are in the 16th century, if not in the medieval pilgrimage. And before the British, there were the Dutch, the Flemish, the French, etc., etc. The British, paradoxically, arrived quite late on the scene, but then, of course, bring the Grand Tour to a different level and making it a truly pan-European phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Adriano. We have time for a few questions, as always, and if you don't mind, I'll ask myself a couple of questions first. And there are so many things that I'm dying to ask you, but we don't have so much time. But first of all, we've seen how art is central to the idea of the Grand Tour. And also we've seen that it's usually a trip that the travelers themselves organize. So it's kind of designed by them. But could you tell us anything about the role the artists themselves played in shaping the tour?
Sure. Really, you understand the Grand Tour only if you understand that it was shaped by artists. And then, you know, the intellectual, the aristocrats followed a path that actually had been opened by artists. Because remember, up until the 17th century, when plaster casts start to be diffused all over Europe, in artist studios, in artist academies all over Europe, beyond the Alps, there were very, very few classical statues that could be seen in the flesh, almost none, right? And the reason why artists came to Rome was first and foremost to copy classical statuary, because two main principles. The first one is that they already had the tradition of posing the live model in a pose that they wanted, right? But the live model can keep the same pose for 30 minutes, and then they need to move. A classical sculpture can stay there forever. And you can copy and copy and copy and copy throughout the day, first and foremost. Second, classical sculptures, they thought, were based, by reading Vitruvius, especially a passage in the third book of Vitruvius, they thought, most of the artists in the Renaissance, they thought that were based on a system of harmonic proportions, whereby everything was connected mathematically, from the smallest measurable unit, let's say the phalanx of the little finger, to the little finger, the palm, the span, the cubit, and then the fathom, etc., etc. Everything was connected. At least this is what Vitruvius mentions in his third book. And the famous visualization of this principle, and Vitruvius goes into the single measurement, the famous visualization is the so-called Vitruvian Man by Leonardo, okay? But unfortunately, none of the sculptures actually respected a proper modular proportion. But the artists nonetheless were there for centuries trying to understand the proportions of the statues, because by understanding the proportion of the statues, you understand the idealization of the anatomy. So artists were supposed, have you seen the Lacan, for instance? We take this so much for granted that we don't even consider this anymore. Look at the Lacan. Sorry, I need to go back. Let's see our friend here. Where is it? Gosh, it was right at the beginning. Where is it?
Oh.
I skipped. It's gone. I skipped it here. Must be here. Okay. So you're looking at a statue of an old priest. Lacan is the famous Trojan priest who tries to warn the Trojans, not to accept the wooden horse of the Achaeans, of the Greeks, in Virgil especially, not in Homer. But of course, no one listens to him. The wooden horse is taken within the walls of Troy. Apollo, who is of course protecting the Greeks, actually punishes Lacan on the seashore of Troy, killing him and his two sons with gigantic snakes because he had, in a way, dared to challenge the will of the gods. He's an old man in his 60s. He's a priest, but look at his anatomy. He's a bodybuilder, isn't he? His chest is the chest of someone in his 20s, right? This is a typical Hellenistic sculpture, probably from Pergamon or most likely from Rhodes. The archaeologists are still trying to understand whether it's an original Hellenistic sculpture or is a Roman re-elaboration of an Hellenistic sculpture. There are two factions. There are many factions on the Lacan still today. There's a German school and there's an Italian school on the Lacan. I'm not going into details, but nonetheless, still you're looking, even in the Hellenistic period, not in the classical period of the 5th century before Christ, this idealization of the human body, which is one of the essential principles of Greek aesthetics, right? So the artists were trying and were, in a way, encouraged to learn this type of anatomy, which was anatomy that had already been idealized, not the anatomy of a real human body with all its imperfections, etc., etc. Because most of the live models where the artists in their studio tried to find usually people working in harbors, because of course, or boxers. These are the favorite, models. But even the boxers and people working manually could not reach this level of idealizations of expression of pathos, of composition, of anatomy, etc., etc. So this is the reason why artists tried to copy over and over and over classical statue and absorb the principles of classical statues in their papers. This is the central, one of the central axes of European aesthetics and of the Grand Tour. Artists went to Rome from the 15th century onwards. Brunelleschi and Masaccio famously went together to Rome at the beginning of the 15th century, but step by step, they structure a phenomenon. Bembo in 1725 already tells us that every day foreign artists arrive in Rome. Probably in the 16th century, they arrived being paid by patrons or saving money. From the 17th century onwards, you have, for instance, the Académie Royale de Peinture et Sculpture, so the French Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris, which established, especially from 1666, the famous Prix de Rome, so the Roman prize. So the best artists in the academy in Paris were given money to travel to Rome, and they were lodged in the French Academy in Rome for 4 years, and it's a phenomenon that goes on still today in the Villa Medici in Rome, as well as many other academies. So step by step, before you have travelers and artists paying their own travels. Then they're sponsored by patrons. And then in the 17th and 18th century, there's an institutional network, an institutional framework that actually allows for artists who notoriously are poor to go to Rome and travel to Rome. Not surprisingly, from the 19th century onwards, the phenomenon carries on in the 19th century. The Grand Tour carries on in the 19th century. We think that it finishes with the Napoleonic Wars, but you have an equal number of artists coming to Rome in the 19th century, but the 19th century, after a new aesthetic, the aesthetic of Romanticism, and then Realism, and then the avant-garde, the aesthetic of the avant-garde in the 19th century finds inspiration from completely different criteria. So step by step, the normative role of sculpture and the normative role that Rome had on European art starts to, to fade away. But until 1968, in most European academies, the poor young artists were forced to copy plaster cast. And in fact, they destroyed them in 1968 as an embodiment of power. In Munich, they threw them famously out of the windows of the first floor, creating a heap of plaster cast, because by 1968 had become, you know, a very obsolete, antiquated, and constraining curriculum. But the artists are crucial.
Thanks. Do we have any questions from the public? Here, there's one. If you wouldn't mind using the microphone, please. También se puede preguntar en español y.
In 1688, when the English declared themselves heirs or spiritual descendants of Romans, no? What did the Italians make of it? What did they think about it? It must have been very confrontation with their pride, no?
Not necessarily, because it's a phenomenon that actually goes as far back as the Middle Ages. So it's a phenomenon that travels through the Middle Ages in a way. The authority of Rome, not the physical city of Rome, which of course already by the 10th century was in ruin, at least from, you know, Justinian in the Byzantine Empire, and then with Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, the authority trying to bring back to the north of Europe the authority of ancient Rome, the political authority, and the cultural authority of ancient Rome is something that it's as old as the early Middle Ages. It's codified by the Carolingian court in Aachen in the 9th century. And there's a phenomenon that is called translatio imperi and translatio studi that runs throughout the Middle Ages. Translatio imperi, so the transfer of imperial political authority. Translatio studi, the transfer of studio, so of culture. So anyone who claimed a supranational authority in the Middle Ages, especially from the 10th century onwards, from the 9th century onwards, refers back to Rome. So the Holy Roman Emperors all refer back to Rome. And also in this nation, Charles V, for instance, or Philip II. Or in the 17th century, Louis XIV and Colbert. So the great Sun King tried to bring as many copies of classical sculpture to Versailles. His prime minister adopted a proper culture of translatio imperi to Paris. Paris becomes the new Rome, to the point that in the 18th century, of course, they are less present in Rome. So it's a phenomenon that you see has gone, and it's not linked to a Roman or an Italian identity anymore in the 18th century in a way. It's true that there's a constant tension between the Italians and the British in the 18th century. Constant tension in terms of culture. The Brits, many of them, most of them, not all of them, go to Rome and they look at Rome through the classical sources that they read during their educational year. Virgil, Cicero, Quintilian, Tacitus, Suetonius, etc., etc. So they look at Rome, they look at ancient Rome, and they despise Catholic modern Rome, as you can imagine, because of course they're Protestant first and foremost. And second, because they see that Rome in the 18th century has an economic decline, a sharp economic decline. And of course they see that it's a city in the grip of the Roman Curia, in the grip of the church, with very little financial and economic investment, which is true to a certain degree because there's a big industry. But yes, this tension is there, but it's not about, you know, claiming the legacy of the empire in a way.
Thank you. What struck me very much as an American on your discussion was the seeming sincerity of the desire to acquire knowledge on the part of the tourists in the centuries you covered. I was actually thinking you'd be talking a little bit about Berenson in the 19th century and the capitalists and the acquisition of legitimacy through the purchase of art. Was there really that much we want to learn and then transfer those ideas to our countries in the period you're talking about?
For sure. I mean, I've showed you the caricature of the young traveler arriving in Rome and being assaulted by prostitutes and dancers. There's that aspect of the Grand Tour. There's, of course, showing off, but most of them, especially those who actually came back to Rome several times, who spent a long period in Rome, were there to transfer this type of culture, is a sort of like cultural signifier. You come back to Britain and you actually, through your commission in architecture, in garden design, through the painting that you show on your walls, to the painting that you commission, to the drawing that you commission, you show that you're part of a taste that actually is highly codified through theory at that time, and has been called in the 19th century the rule of taste, retrospectively, which becomes a channel through which, for the first time in European history, and especially in British history, different classes can dialogue in the same environment. So, for instance, in the Society of Antiquaries, you had the Duke of Northumberland, you have the Earl of Leicester, but you had also Dr. Mead, Sir Hans Sloane, a banker, so doctor, bankers, merchants, etc., etc. And through this shared classical culture, which is the component of what was called already in the 17th century the Republic of Letter, a transnational Republic of Letter that, of course, goes well beyond national boundaries. There's a sort of ideal Republic of Letter which actually is pan-European. Through these discussions, through this erudite interest, etc., etc., they can dialogue on the same level. The Society of Antiquaries, which is founded in 1717, if memory serves me right, is a classic example of these societies where this type of knowledge was brought back. You're American. Jefferson, certainly, we can say whatever we want about Jefferson today, but certainly wanted to bring back that type of enlightened classicist to Virginia. He was a slave owner, and we know all that. But with the commission of the University of Virginia, Charlottesville, with Monticello, with Mount Poplar, etc., etc., he tries to bring back Palladian and classical principles to a territory that is agricultural. So he tries to recreate the Veneto in Virginia, if you see what I mean. So it's a matter of exactly the classical principle and the legacy of Rome used to legitimize early modern European identity and even American identity. Rome is not a city, Rome is a concept. And has been one of the most powerful concepts in European politics and imagery for 2,000 years, and goes well beyond the physical Rome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Una pregunta más.
Hola, yo voy a hablar en castellano.
Ok.
Bueno,
Lentamente.
Sí, sí.
Capisco.
Bueno, quería informar que en la Escuela Superior de Diseño de Palma, de las Islas Baleares, que está cerca de aquí, todavía existe una sala de esculturas.
Perfecto.
De yeso, que forman parte, algunas, de la colección del cardenal Antoni Despuig, que en el 1779 fundó la Escuela Gratuita de Dibujo con las teorías de la Ilustración, y él mismo hizo el Grand Tour y tenía una gran colección de esculturas de yeso que, lamentablemente, bueno, en la escuela creo que quedan dos, pero
dos
sí,
que
y las otras auténticas,
Uh-huh.
y las otras son copias que se han ido haciendo durante años. Y estas estaban en la villa, ahora no me sale el nombre, en Rasha, y las, es verdad, y la gran parte de esta colección se la vendió a un cervecero de Múnich, que, como has comentado, en Múnich tiraron las esculturas por la ventana, pues este cervecero, que tampoco sé el nombre, pero es de una cerveza conocida, fue el que compró las esculturas para su gliptoteca.
¿En Russia?
Las de Rasha se vendieron.
Russia is a village here in
Sí, pero
Rusia.
perdón, una villa, sí,
Una villa.
una villa.
Ma Mónica ha comprado los
Sí.
¿cómo se dice en español?
Las esculturas
No, el calco, ¿cómo se dice?
Yes.
Yes.
el yeso.
There's another, ok, yesos.
Sí.
Yesos. So, Mónaco ha acquistado la escultura de yesos de Palma de Mallorca.
Una gran parte de la colección. Y hay otras que todavía, quedan en Palma, algunas en la Escuela Superior de Diseño y otras en el Castillo de Belver, que todavía se pueden ver. Incluso hay alguna de mármol también.
Okay.
And the
Interessante.
portrait of the nephew of this ecclesiastic is in Museo de Arte Sacro, and I've told you
Why
about
did
it.
you tell me?
There is like a batoni.
Tomorrow we'll
similar
go there
to
to see it. Is this school open tomorrow?
Yes, yes.
Can I come and visit?
I will speak later with you.
Perfect. Great.
Perfect.
Fantastic.
Sí.
Mhm.
Y el Castell de Berber también.
Perfecto. Okay.
You're
Yes.
organizing a grand tour for Adriano, clearly. And can I have one are there any other questions from the public? Mira, una aquí.
It's not really a question. I was surprised, and also it's funny to see how the industry anticipate the needs and the desires of the traveler and create a whole industry just to make benefit, to make money out of it. Is not a new thing in those days. It's also, I was surprised, it was funny. But can you go back again in the beginning of your exposition? You talk about the way they finance, and that it was very difficult and they took 2 years, because it was a question that also they make. It was funny, I remember in the first conference, there was a question about that, and you mentioned it, and I said, oh, but I didn't pay so much attention in this moment. Can you explain
For
again?
sure. Let's focus only on the 18th century, because of course the phenomenon. I'll give you an example. The aristocrats, if they have enough financial power, of course, paid for a tutor or tutor to accompany the young son, usually. In the late 18th century, you have also a lot of women, but very often they travel with their husbands. Some of them traveled alone, but most, of course, were young men. Usually, the aristocrat pays for a tutor to go with the young boy, a coach, and a retinue of servants. You arrive in Rome and you have a network of bankers, a lodge, an hotel. So it was already planned from London. There's a very good postal system in the 18th century. Everything was planned, and of course, this is people with great financial power. Those who could not travel because they were not of aristocratic birth or gentry, and they were intellectuals like Locke, like Gibbon, like many others, worked as tutors. So they actually accompanied the young gentlemen in their grand tour because of their classical knowledge and classical education. And in this way, they could make the grand tour themselves. Then you have the artist. The artist, either they were sponsored by their family, if they had enough money, or by patrons. You had to catch, the attention of a patron, especially in Britain, because the Royal Academy of Art is established in 1768, one of the last academies in Europe. So before, there was no system. So you had to convince a patron that you were a promising young artist and to sponsor that. There's another way. In fact, it would be fun to write. There are several books on the logistics of the Grand Tour, especially by a guy called, of course, I don't remember his name, but it's called The British and the Grand Tour, John Brewer. I don't want to check. The British and the Grand Tour is a great book on the logistics. And there's another example, great families of architects. Robert and James Adam, probably the most famous architects of the last 40 years of the 18th century. They came from a family of architects in Scotland, in Edinburgh, right? They embarked on a grand tour paid by their family. So the father, William Adam, knew that actually to finish the education of the young generation and to, in a way, propose a new type of architecture, first Robert and then James had to spend a lot of years, and was incredibly, incredibly expensive, to the point that the family wants Robert Adam to come back from Rome earlier because he's spending too much. But he spends from 1754 to 1758 in Rome, 4 years. So exactly, that's the difference between aristocratic travelers and artists and architects. Many artists and architects spent many years in Rome. Some of them never went back, like Gavin Hamilton, James Byers, and became dealers. So many of them actually remained in Rome and became dealers in the golden age of the Grand Tour that goes from 1763, with the end of the War of Spanish succession, to to 1792 with the Napoleonic invasion of Italy. This 30 years is the golden age of the Grand Tour, the so-called golden age, at least in terms of quantitative terms, so numbers of travelers who went to Rome. But you see, there are many different ways of traveling, in a way. Either you have the means, or you find someone who pays for you, or your family makes a huge investment. It's like today, you know, Chinese families sending, it's like, you know, Chinese families sending their son to Harvard and paying an enormous amount of money. You see what I mean? It's a type of investment, and then they think will pay back when they come back, and they will become part of the ruling elite.
The beginning of tourism.
The beginning of tourism in the 19th century. Right. The 18th century was still.
Well, Adriano, thank you so much again for a fantastic tour of 18th century culture and art. It's been a real pleasure to have you here. I hope you enjoyed, and also hope you will have a couple of fruitful visits tomorrow here in Palma. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And many questions, huh? Good.